Let's go to Johannesburg because Ropiwa wants to bring her guest in on some of the things we've been hearing from the ministers. Ropiwa, it's all yours.
Very interesting insights that have come through there, and I was chatting to Peter Attard Montalto from Intellidex. So, Peter, you were talking about the fact that the president, there's absolutely nothing he could say to instill confidence, and one of the big thorns on everyone's side at the moment is this controversial Tottenham Hotspur deal that was made by SA Tourism. What did you make of Minister Lindiwe Sisulu's remarks? She seemed very dismissive about what is a very, very critical decision at a time when the money could be well spent elsewhere.
Well, I think I was wrong before. I mean, I think there is actually one thing he could say. He could say he's reshuffling his cabinet, removing Lindiwe Sisulu, removing people who don't understand the urgency of the energy crisis. And he has an opportunity, a prime opportunity now, to put in place a transport minister who actually understands we have a really, really serious problem with Transnet, which is on the verge of both operational and financial collapse. So no, I think there are things he can say, and that's why the reshuffle is going to be more important than the speech. It's going to be actually an opportunity to show some action and put in place a cabinet that will actually be able to carry forward his mandate that he lays out in the speech this evening.
I mean, you've weighed in quite a bit on the new top 7 that was elected at the National Conference in December. Do you feel, or have you gotten a sense that they will have the kind of strength to be able to carry out some tough decisions, not only to put competent leaders into positions of power when this reshuffle happens, but that they'll be able to make the difficult decisions that may turn the tide perhaps for South Africa's economy?
No, I don't think there's any real evidence of that. I mean, we have notionally and politically a more aligned top 7 to the president. But what they do with that is then another question. We equally have to remember that's offset by the fact that the president is increasingly beholden to the current chairperson of the ANC. And I think that causes a lot of problems. We're going to see that coming out in terms of still a slow pace of energy reform and also in terms of what happens in the reshuffle. I don't think the president's going to, unfortunately, be able to remove the energy minister in the reshuffle either. So I don't think that sort of more united top 7 behind the president is actually buying very much in terms of the economic outcomes, the reform outcomes, quite yet. Now, that's not to say there is no reform going on. There's quite a bit of reform going on, and we're going to see the president highlighting that tonight. There's just not enough critical speed here in a large enough number of areas to really drive growth higher and unemployment lower fast enough.
And that's quite concerning. And we've seen over the last 2 days or so, Peter, the rand has weakened quite a bit over against the US dollar. And of course, it tends to really pay close attention to what comes out of what the president has to say. It's currently trading at around 17 Rand 70. And one would assume that market participants are not really optimistic about what happens after today, particularly when you've got the likes of the SARS Commissioner, Edward Kieswetter, indicating that revenue collection is going to be a lot lower. So we're going to be a few millions short in our kitty, it looks like, in this fiscal year.
So, yes, a lot of things came together for the rand market in the last couple of days, which I think solidified and made people understand the full implications of the underlying view. Everyone knows there's going to be a load of load shedding through this year, but those interventions from the retailers, that intervention from SARS there, I think really hit home actually how bad things are going to be. And we saw that repricing of the rand start to go on. So I don't think, it's also pointing to the fact that the budget's going to be a little bit more difficult than we thought it would be. We still have a pretty good terms of trade position in terms of commodity taxes, banking taxes coming through to the fiscus, but offset by lower underlying growth as well, making the other event in 2.5 weeks time more difficult on top of that. And that's the adjustment that we've seen. And that's behind the reason that the yield curve as well remains so steep, which, of course, crowds out other forms of government spending and makes that budget even more challenging still.
And Peter, I mean, what does this mean for the investment climate at the moment? You can see in those boardrooms that there's a lot of gloom in terms of operating in the country at the moment. You've just mentioned the retailers now, the likes of ShopRite, Pick n Pay, and some other big retailers that are just saying we cannot continue to absorb the high cost of operating because of the continued power cuts. The investment climate in South Africa surely is going to take a bigger knock, despite what the president might have to say. say, just because of the mismanagement of critical institutions like Eskom and, of course, like Transnet, which has been described by the Minerals Council as being just as bad as the power cuts.
Well, indeed, I think that's the interesting difference between the short-term indicator like the Rand and some of the long-term investment decisions like the miners are making. We heard that in the Indaba earlier in the week. I think in the short term, a lot of fear, and that's why we're seeing volatility in markets. Long term, though, I think people can see that there is a potential end to load shedding. There's a potential end to the Transnet crisis. They just need to see a little bit more implementation in the short term to bridge these difficult gaps, right? If everything goes right on energy policy, it's still going to be about 2 years before we can substantively end load shedding. Unfortunately, the time lags on Transnet are even longer still. But I think that's why that implementation point is so important in the short term, to tide in those FDI and those domestic corporate investors for the long term. But no, things are definitely looking more challenging around making those decisions, and they're the sorts of things and those timelines, those lengths of time before you see a reform come through are exactly what boards as well as equity investors are talking about a lot at the moment.
Peter, do you think that he might talk about the grey listing at all? We did see some policy implementations in December that were put through by National Treasury, and I'm just wondering if he might make mention of it in the speech in terms of actions that will be taken in the coming weeks ahead of that decision being made. One would assume that it is of great importance to mention the looming grey listing, particularly when we come off the back of what you've just described in terms of investment and really just having confidence in South Africa's economy.
Well, the grey listing is a done deal, so it's pretty challenging, I think, for the president to really talk about it. The passing of those laws was done too late. The FATF has a 6-month cut-off deadline before its plenary, which South Africa missed. So it's going to be a challenge for him to talk about it. I think if he talks about how you get off grey lists as quick as possible, how you keep the momentum of these reforms that we are seeing going on, that would be a more positive way maybe of holding sentiment on that point. But if he talks about avoiding grey listing, I think that will come back to bite him very quickly from the FATF plenary on the 24th.
Peter, as always, thank you very much for those insights, saying there is one good thing that could come out of this speech, and that is, or well, rather, the president's actions over the next few days, and that is the reshuffle and putting competent people in positions of power. That is Peter Attard Montalto, who's the head of capital markets and research at Intellidex, joining us this evening.